It was February 1992, Beverly Hills. The Grammys had ended 3 hours earlier. The performances were done, the trophies handed, the speeches given and forgotten. Now the real evening began. The one that didn't get televised, the one that the people in the room would remember differently from each other for the rest of their lives. The suite belonged to a major label, maybe 80 people, producers, executives, artists at the height of their commercial power. The kind of room where everyone had already won something, where the question was no longer whether you mattered, but how long you intended to keep mattering. Elton John was near the window, 44 years old, famous for 22 of them. He was talking to a producer using the particular voice he used at industry gatherings. Warm, present, slightly performed, engaged enough to be polite, distant enough to remain intact. Someone touched his arm. "Nirvana just arrived," she said. Elton John looked at her for a moment. "Which floor is the bar on?" he said. He had been saying it for months, not publicly. Elton John was too experienced to be openly dismissive of a movement the press had decided to love. But in rooms like this one, among people who shared his understanding of what music was supposed to do, he had been saying it. That grunge was a reaction, not a contribution. That anger without melody was just noise with better marketing. "Melody is the hardest thing," he had said at a dinner in London 3 months earlier. "Anyone can make something abrasive. The discipline is in the beauty." He believed this. He had built his entire career on it. He had listened to Nevermind when it was released, the way a craftsman examines a competitor's work, carefully without generosity. The production was deliberately rough in a way that only very expensive production could achieve. The voice was untrained, raw in a way that some people confuse for emotion. "It's theater," he had said. "Different theater than what we do, but theater." The table had agreed. The party was still building when Nirvana came in. There were 4 of them: Kurt, Chris, Dave, and someone from management. And they moved through the room the way people move when they are aware it doesn't entirely belong to them. Not aggressive, not performing humility either. Just present. Kurt was wearing a dress, a floral print, slightly too large, over worn jeans. His hair was unwashed and pale, hanging around his face in a way that looked accidental, but probably wasn't. He was 24 years old and had spent the last 4 months being the most talked about musician in the world. He carried this the way someone carries something heavy, aware of the weight, not particularly interested in discussing it. He took a drink from a passing tray, said something to Chris that made Chris laugh, looked around the room with the expression of someone cataloging exits. Elton John, who had not moved from the window, watched this from across the room. He recognized the exit cataloging expression. He had worn it himself in rooms like this a very long time ago. He turned back to his conversation. It was about 20 minutes later. Someone had set up a small acoustic corner near the far wall. 2 chairs, a guitar leaning against one of them, the kind of semi-formal arrangement that happened at industry parties where the point was always, eventually, music. A guitarist from a well-known band was playing something slow and bluesy, and a small crowd had formed around him. Then it shifted. Elton John was not watching when it happened. He heard it, or rather, he heard the room change. The quality of the ambient noise altered in a way that was specific and unmistakable to anyone who had spent decades performing. The conversations didn't stop exactly. They lowered, redistributed. The weight of the room's attention moved across the floor like weather. He turned. Kurt Cobain had picked up the guitar. He was sitting in one of the chairs, the floral dress pooling around the jeans. The guitar resting against his body at an angle that looked slightly wrong and sounded, when the first chord arrived, completely right. He was not warming up. He was not testing the instrument. He played the first chord and it landed in the room with a certainty that made the previous playing seem, by comparison, like furniture. Elton John did not move toward the corner. He stayed where he was, near the window, and listened. The first thing he noticed was the left hand. He had played piano for 35 years and had spent more time than he could account for watching other musicians' hands. Hands told you things that faces concealed. They told you how much of what you were hearing was technique and how much was something else. Something that lived below technique. That technique was just the vehicle for. Kurt's left hand moved on the neck without urgency. Not fast, not showy. It did not perform any of the movements guitarists use when they are aware of being watched. It moved with the unhurriedness of someone who was not thinking about the hand at all, because the hand already knew, because it had been doing this long enough that it operated below the level of conscious instruction. The chord progression was simple. 3 chords, maybe 4, cycling with a patience that could have been boring and wasn't. Then the voice came in. Elton John's relationship with voices was long and complicated. He had written for voices, for other singers, for himself, and he understood the instrument the way a tailor understands fabric. He knew what training produced and what it couldn't. He knew the difference between a voice shaped by discipline and a voice shaped by something prior to discipline, something that discipline could refine but not create. Kurt Cobain's voice was the second kind. It was not a conservatory voice. There were things it couldn't reach, notes it would never hold cleanly. But in the range where it lived, slightly low, slightly hoarse, it did something Elton John had not heard in a long time. It told the truth, not performed truth. The truth that happens when a voice stops managing itself and simply opens. And what comes out is exactly the interior of the person producing it, unedited, present. Elton John stood very still. The room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something is happening that no one wants to interrupt. Elton John watched the faces. He knew these faces. People who had seen everything the industry produced in the last 20 years, who had built up the specific callus that comes from making music a business. The callus was not working. He could see it in the small things. Drinks no longer being sipped, half-finished sentences abandoned, bodies turned incrementally toward the corner. A woman who ran A&R for one of the largest labels had her eyes closed. Kurt was playing a third song now. Each one had been quieter than the last, pulling slightly further inward, and the room had followed him there without being asked. Elton John thought about what he had said at that London dinner. Melody is the hardest thing. He was still thinking about it, but differently. He left before the set ended, not abruptly, not in a way that announced itself. He finished his drink, said something brief to the person beside him, and moved toward the exit with the practiced ease of someone who leaves parties early by habit and has learned to make departure look like continuation. In the elevator going down, he stood with 2 people he didn't know and said nothing. The numbers descended. The music was still playing, 3 floors above, inaudible now. Outside in the February air, his car was waiting. He got in. The driver asked if he was going back to the hotel. "Yes," Elton John said. He sat in the back of the car with the window up and the city moving past and said nothing else for the entire ride. Not because there was nothing to say, because he needed to put some distance between himself and the room before he could begin to say it, even to himself. He had left because he needed to think, and he could not think in that room, not with the voice still in it. He did not sleep well. He lay in the hotel room and thought about craft, about what he had spent 35 years building. The craft was real. He could feel it in the architecture of the songs, in the way a bridge resolved or a melody returned. It mattered. It was his. But there was a question underneath it that the voice had placed there. What is the craft in service of? He had believed, without examining the belief, that craft was the point, that the trained voice, the considered melody, the perfectly constructed arrangement were the end toward which all musical instincts should be directed. But what he had heard tonight was not primarily craft. It was something that existed before craft. A directness, a cost. The sense that what came out of the guitar and the voice was not constructed, but simply released. And it had reached further into the room than anything constructed could have reached. Craft served truth. Not the other way around. He had forgotten which one was primary. He told the story publicly for the first time in 2012, a long-form interview about his career. At some point, the conversation arrived at the early 90s, and Elton John found himself talking about the Grammy party without having planned to. He described it carefully, the room, the guitar, the dress, the way the crowd went quiet. "I left," he said. Before he finished, the interviewer asked why. Elton John was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to process what I was hearing," he finally said, And I couldn't do that in the room where it was happening. He paused again. I had spent months dismissing what that band was doing. Not publicly. I wasn't foolish enough for that. But privately, in conversations. I had a whole argument constructed. Melody over noise. Craft over rawness. I believed it genuinely. And, the interviewer said, and he sat down with a guitar at a party and played 3 songs, and the argument collapsed. Elton John smiled slightly, not quite at the interviewer. Not because the argument was wrong exactly, but because it was answering the wrong question. He looked at his hands. Craft is how you say something. He reminded me that there has to be a something, that the craft has to be carrying something real, or it's just decoration. Very beautiful decoration sometimes. But decoration. The interviewer asked whether he had ever spoken to Kurt Cobain that night. No, Elton John said. I walked past him on the way out. He was still playing. I don't think he noticed me leave. He paused. I don't think he noticed much of anything that wasn't the music. That was part of it. He wasn't performing for the room. He was just doing the thing. And the room came to him. Another pause, longer. He died 2 years later. I never told him that he made me reconsider something I'd been carrying for 20 years. I've thought about that. The interviewer waited. You spend enough time in this industry, Elton John said, and you start to mistake fluency for depth. You mistake the ability to produce something beautiful for the reason to produce something beautiful. He didn't make that mistake, or if he did, it wasn't visible. He stopped. What was visible was someone who meant every single note. In a room full of people who were very good at this, and not all of them still meant it. He looked up. That's what I walked away from. That's what I couldn't stay in the room for. Not because it was better than what I did, but because it reminded me of something I used to know and had stopped asking about. The party on the 32nd floor continued until nearly 4 in the morning. Kurt played for maybe 35 minutes in total. Then he set the guitar back against the chair, stood up, and returned to the group he had arrived with. The conversations resumed. The evening moved forward the way evenings move forward, without ceremony, without acknowledgement that anything had changed. Nobody photographed it. Nobody recorded it. It existed only in the memories of the 80 people who were there. And those memories, as memories do, diverged and softened over the years until no 2 accounts were entirely the same. But certain things remained consistent across all of them. The floral dress, the 3 songs, the silence of the crowd, and the figure who had been standing near the window, one of the most famous musicians in the world, someone who had spent 22 years being looked at, who had turned at some point and was no longer there. Nobody in the room had seen him go. He had simply been present, and then he hadn't been. And later, much later, he would explain that he had left because something in that corner had answered a question he hadn't known he was still asking. The question had been there for years, underneath the craft, underneath the fluency, underneath the decades of knowing exactly how to make something beautiful. It had taken a 24-year-old in a floral dress, sitting in a chair at a party he didn't particularly want to be at, to make it audible again. The rooms that change us are rarely the rooms we prepared for. They are the rooms we wandered into sideways, on free evenings, not expecting anything. And what changes us is never the thing we were looking for. It is the thing that was already there, waiting, playing quietly in the corner, not performing for anyone, least of all for the one person in the room who most needed to hear it.